Good morning. Today we look at 1 Kings chapters 3, 4, and 5. And again, just yesterday, Solomon had become firmly established as king. And now he begins chapter 3 with making an alliance with Pharaoh of Egypt. And it says he took Pharaoh's daughter as a wife and brought her into the city of David until he finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. So he had quite a project going on, Solomon did. And as we read on, we get into toward the end of chapter 5 where we're reading, just to jump ahead there, it says that, he conscripted forced labor out of all of Israel. 30,000 people, men, he conscripted to labor. 10,000 of them would work a month, and then they had 1 month they worked and 2 months they would be at home again. And in addition to those 30,000 conscripted forced labor, people, he had a crew of 70,000 laborers and 3,300 supervisors who were overseeing the work. And this was the building of the temple, the building of the wall around Jerusalem, and the building of Solomon's home as well. And I was just thinking, that's a lot of men. And it makes sense because it helps make sense of some of what we're going to read in chapter 3 of the numbers of supplies that he needed every day. The number of cattle and of sheep, the wheat and everything needed to feed all of these people, because that was the king's responsibility as well, to keep them all fed. But before we get into all of that, verse 3 says Solomon loved the Lord, and he was following, the offering and the sacrifices and the offerings. And although he was making sacrifices on the high places, the temple wasn't constructed yet, but there were designated places that God said, this is where you will make the offerings and the sacrifices. And Solomon was guilty of sacrificing and making offerings in places that, he really wasn't supposed to. But in the midst of all of that, as this chapter 3 really sets the stage for Solomon's rule, because, he has a vision from God. And, God comes and says, to Solomon, ask what I should give you. And, anytime, we read of the rubbing the lamp and getting 3 wishes, the genie gives you 3 wishes. So think about God saying, what is it that you would want me to give you? We would, riches, fame, but we know the story that, Solomon asks for, he says in verse 9, give me an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil, for who can govern this great number of people? So he asks for wisdom, and we know that. And Solomon is considered, one of the greatest minds, and it says in here how many psalms he wrote, and songs, 1,005 songs, and the Proverbs, we have the book of Proverbs, and those are mostly snippets of Solomon's wisdom. And, many of them aren't, long, but they're just a verse or two, and I have a proverb hanging up on my wall that says, it's better to remain silent and thought a fool than to open one's mouth and to remove all doubt. And I think that's a kind of a neat, proverb, It's better to remain silent and thought a fool than to open one's mouth and remove all doubt. Anyway, Solomon was very smart in asking in asking God for this gift of wisdom, understanding, insight. And God then says, because you have chosen so wisely, you will also be rich, and you will live in a time of peace. And, he says, I will give you this wisdom, but I will also give you riches and honor. No other king shall compare to you. And even though Solomon was a great king, Part of the problem with Solomon was that he fell away from much of what God would have had him do. And he was very susceptible to the allure of women, and we'll find that out, when the Queen of Sheba comes to visit him at another later date. But Solomon's wisdom is and when God had asked Solomon, what would you have? Solomon says, well, I am only a youth. Well, he was 20, maybe a little over 20, so he wasn't just a boy when he became king, although, 20 years old, no matter how old we are, we still have a lot to learn, but, a 20-year-old doesn't have a lot of experience, but, it makes it sound like he's, a child, but, in many ways he understood. He had a lot of way to go. And then the testing, one of the best known tests of Solomon's wisdom is when these two prostitute women come to him, and you think about that too. These women have no standing in community, yet they come to the king to settle a dispute. And this is quite a dispute, we know that, but they've each had a child, and one's child has died, and the other tries to steal the living child. And the wisdom of Solomon, as he says, well, bring me a sword, Well, of course, the mother, the real, true mother, no, save the child, let her have it, let my child live, and so the wisdom that he has in making that decision, and then the real mother is given the child. We know that story. It's one of the greatest stories and examples of Solomon's wisdom we have. And so as we have had that introduction into Solomon's wisdom, in chapter 4, we hear, he's the king over all of Israel. So, it's the United Kingdom, Judah and the Northern Kingdom. And it remains that way for the 40 years that Solomon reigns pretty much. And then they have a list of all of his officers, and then not only his officers, but he has 12 officials, to provide food for, and each one is responsible for a month. And we have those 12 listed, and not only listed by name, but also by family history, the son of so-and-so, son of so-and-so, so that, that, again, that genealogy is so important to the Israelites. Verse 20 of chapter 4, Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea. And again, here's the promise from God to Abraham. Your descendants will be, more numerous than the stars. You won't be able to count. So they have come that way. And, they have a peaceful relationship with all of the surrounding nations, and the people of Israel bring their tributes to the government, because that's, kind of the taxation. You got to support your government that way. And then verse 22 is when we get into this. It says, Solomon's provisions for one day was 30 cores of choice flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep besides the deer. As I mentioned earlier, this was a tremendous amount of food. And I didn't look, I don't remember how much a core is, C-O-R, but later on in chapter 5, it talks about that Solomon's gift to the king of Tyre and Sidon was like 20 cores of fine oil, which is like 900,000 gallons. So, 20,000, he gave you 20,000 cores of wheat, but just 20 cores of fine oil. And I don't know, but this is a tremendous amount of oil, and to think about, having to transport that as well. But, just the amount of food that they needed to feed all of the laborers and everybody that was dependent upon the king that way. And verse 25 says, during Solomon's lifetime, they all lived in safety, and he had 40,000 stalls of horses. And, you think about all of the the food and the needs and everything that way. And, you know, for us, for me, I mean, you think about the mind-boggling numbers of dollars that the government spends, you know, it's just, I mean, it just can't really get all of that into our heads, but tremendous need they have. Chapter 5, King Hiram of Tyre and Sidon, they're the two countries further north, and they referred to as the Sidonians here, but the residents up there of Tyre and Sidon come to be known as the Phoenicians at a later point in time. But as Solomon is going to begin constructing the temple, he talks to the king of Tyre and says, we need some of your cypress trees to build this temple. And they make the agreement because this king had a good relationship also with King David. And so the big cypress trees are cut, and all of this, you know, like this, you know, 900,000 gallons of oil and, you know, 125,000 tons of wheat, you know, I mean, bushels of wheat. I mean, the sheer amount is just mind-boggling. But then again, I mean, this, you know, this numbers of people and everything that goes on is again, it just seems to be, how can there be that many that are there and the need so great? But Solomon is beginning his reign, and so far everything is going pretty well.